There are nights when space feels less like something distant and more like something watching quietly from just beyond thought. Not in a threatening way, but in the same way an old ceiling fan might feel familiar even when you're half asleep, spinning without explanation, never asking for attention. The Black Knight satellite is one of those stories that never fully settles. It appears, disappears, gets explained, gets denied, and somehow still remains. A signal detected decades ago, a shape in old photographs, a fragment of radio noise that some people insist was never fully decoded. And between all of that, there is a strange silence, the kind that makes your mind fill in gaps it probably shouldn't. What makes it linger isn't proof, it's absence of closure. NASA explanations exist, sure, and so do military clarifications, but none of them feel like they close the door completely. They just gently push it, leaving it slightly ajar. And maybe that's why this story survives. Not because it proves something is out there, but because it never fully proves that nothing is. It starts, as many strange stories do, with something that doesn't feel strange at all, just a signal. A routine moment in a time when space was still new enough that even the simplest noise from above felt like progress. The early years of satellites were not clean or precise the way people imagine them now. Everything was fragile. Instruments misread things. Signals bent in ways they weren't fully prepared for, and in that uncertainty, small irregularities sometimes stayed longer in memory than they should have. One of those irregularities was something radio operators later described as echoes. Not echoes in the poetic sense, real ones. A transmission sent out, then returning again after a delay that didn't make immediate sense. At first, nobody paid too much attention. The sky was already full of interference. Earth itself was noisy in radio terms. Lightning, atmospheric reflections, early military transmissions, experimental signals bouncing between layers of ionosphere that were still being studied and misunderstood. But these echoes, they didn't always behave like that. They sometimes returned seconds later, sometimes much longer. Enough time that the original signal should have already dispersed, been absorbed, or lost its structure entirely. And yet, there it was again, repeating softly, like something trying to speak back without quite remembering the language. In the Black Knight narrative, this is often where the story begins. But in reality, it never began as a story. It began as scattered reports, notes in logbooks, amateur radio operators mentioning odd delays, professional stations quietly marking anomalies without certainty on what category they even belonged to. There is something important here that often gets lost when people talk about it later. No one at the time said, "We are receiving something artificial from orbit." That idea came much later, shaped by decades of reinterpretation and imagination. At the time, it was just unexplained behavior in a system that was still being learned. And learning, in those early years of space communication, was slow. The late 1950s and early 1960s carried a kind of technological innocence that is hard to recreate now. Sputnik had already changed the world's sense of direction. Suddenly, the sky was no longer just weather and stars. It was also machinery. Objects made by human hands were circling above, silent but trackable. And once something becomes trackable, people begin to expect consistency from it. So when something didn't behave consistently, even slightly, it stood out more than it might today. There were moments where tracking stations reported brief anomalies, a signal arriving a fraction too late, a return echo that didn't match known reflection models. Engineers would double-check equipment, operators would recalibrate. And often the simplest explanation would eventually be accepted: atmospheric distortion, equipment delay, or overlapping transmissions. But not every instance felt fully resolved. Some were set aside with quiet uncertainty, not labeled as solved, just not worth pursuing further with the tools available at the time. And that is where the space between fact and interpretation begins to widen, because human memory doesn't preserve uncertainty very well. It tends to reshape it. Slowly, over years, those small unresolved notes can gather weight they never originally carried. One of the most commonly referenced early threads connected to the Black Knight idea involves long-delayed radio echoes reported by a Norwegian amateur operator in the late 1920s. A man named Jorgen Hals recorded signals that appeared to return several seconds after transmission. At the time, there was no satisfying explanation. The phenomenon was noted, discussed briefly, and then largely left alone. Decades later, those same reports would be revisited, reinterpreted, and connected to entirely different narratives involving orbiting objects and unknown structures in space. But in their original form, they were simply curiosities, scientific puzzles without enough data to solve. It's important to sit with that distinction for a moment, because it shows how easily the mind fills silence. When something cannot be explained immediately, it does not remain empty. It begins to attract meaning, not necessarily false meaning, but layered meaning, possible meaning, and over time, those layers can become indistinguishable from the original observation. By the time satellite tracking became more advanced, the language had changed. Engineers no longer spoke in terms of mystery. They spoke in terms of error margins, signal degradation, orbital mechanics, and reflection coefficients. The unknown was gradually pushed into categories that felt more manageable. Still, occasional anomalies remained, not dramatic ones, not cinematic ones, just small inconsistencies that didn't always fully resolve on first analysis. And in a system as vast as Earth's early space communication network, small inconsistencies were almost expected. Yet the human mind rarely treats expected uncertainty the same way it treats unexplained uncertainty. This is where the Black Knight story begins to drift away from its scientific roots and into something more interpretive. Because years later, when images of space debris, thermal blankets, and experimental satellite fragments began circulating publicly, they were sometimes re-examined through a different lens. Objects that had originally been identified as ordinary or irrelevant were now viewed with suspicion simply because they were seen through the framework of a growing mystery. The signal came first, then the interpretation, then, much later, the identity. But in the early records, there is no single moment where someone points and says, "This is artificial, non-human, and orbiting Earth in secret." That moment does not exist in documented form. What exists instead is a collection of small, separate uncertainties that never fully aligned with one another. And yet they stayed in circulation, partly because they were interesting, partly because they were unresolved, and partly because humans are naturally drawn to patterns that feel like they might connect if seen from a slightly different angle. there is also something quieter here, something less discussed. The early space age was not just a scientific period, it was an emotional one. Humanity was stepping into orbit for the first time. There was excitement, but also fear, even if it wasn't always spoken directly. The idea that something else could already be there, watching or waiting, fit easily into the emotional background of that era, not because it was proven, but because it was imaginable. And imagination, once it finds a small gap in understanding, rarely leaves it empty. Still, when you strip everything back, what remains is not a structure in space, not a confirmed object, not a definitive anomaly. What remains is a pattern of human observation trying to make sense of incomplete information, signals that didn't always match expectations, echoes that returned later than predicted, and a long history of people revisiting those moments, each time adding a little more interpretation than the last. It's easy, now, to see how a narrative could grow from that, not through deception, but through accumulation. Layer by layer, each explanation stacking on top of the previous uncertainty, until the original shape becomes hard to recognize. And somewhere in that accumulation, the idea of something persistent in orbit begins to take form, not fully defined, not fully dismissed either, just lingering. Like a thought that never quite finishes itself. And maybe that is where we should leave this first part of the story, not at a conclusion, but at the point where certainty has not yet entered the room and everything is still allowed to remain slightly unresolved. Because the moment certainty arrives, the echo usually stops changing, and in this story, the echo is still moving. There's a certain quiet that follows an unanswered signal, not the dramatic kind of silence people imagine in stories, but something softer, more ordinary. The kind you don't really notice until you realize it's been there the whole time. After those early reports of strange echoes and irregular returns, nothing immediately changed. No alarms, no public announcements, no sudden shift in how space was being studied. Most of the world kept moving forward, as if the sky had simply remained what it always was. But inside the technical rooms where these signals were being logged, something subtle did change. People began to listen a little more carefully. Not because they were convinced something unusual was there, but because uncertainty has a way of making even routine data feel slightly heavier than before. Every unexpected delay in transmission, every minor fluctuation, started to carry a small question with it. Not spoken out loud, just quietly present in the background of analysis. And over time, that quiet attention creates its own kind of memory. This is where the Black Knight narrative slowly begins to drift away from its original context. Not through a single discovery, but through repeated revisiting of old material. The same logs, the same recordings, the same fragmented notes, each time interpreted with slightly different expectations. There were moments when engineers would go back through earlier data, not because they believed something had been missed, but because new instruments had made old readings feel less certain in hindsight. That is something people often forget about early space science. It wasn't just about discovery. It was also about constant reevaluation. What looked like noise in one year could look like structure in another, and what looked like structure could collapse back into noise just as easily. In that shifting space between interpretations, stories begin to form, not intentionally, not as fabrication. but as a kind of mental stitching together of incomplete pieces. The radio echoes that were once noted as curiosities began to be discussed again in different contexts, sometimes in academic discussions about ionospheric reflection, sometimes in informal conversations among operators who had lived through those early experiments. And sometimes, just sometimes, in more speculative spaces where people were willing to ask questions that didn't need immediate answers. It is in those spaces that the idea of something persistent in orbit started to take a more defined shape, not as a confirmed object, but as a possibility that refused to fully disappear. Years later, when satellite imagery became more accessible and public interest in space grew significantly, older anomalies were revisited with new curiosity. Images that once had no particular meaning were now examined more closely. Shadows, reflections, blurred shapes in early photographs of space missions, all of them became potential candidates for reinterpretation, and this is where perception begins to shift in a very subtle way. Because once a concept like unknown object in orbit exists in the cultural background, the brain starts to recognize patterns differently. It doesn't need to be convinced. It only needs to be familiar with the idea. That familiarity changes what people notice. Not necessarily what is there, but what stands out. NASA and other space agencies have consistently explained most of the associated claims as misinterpretations of space debris, thermal insulation materials, or fragments from human-made missions. And scientifically, those explanations hold strong weight. Space is filled with material that reflects light in unusual ways, especially in early photography. But explanations don't always erase emotional residue, because the Black Knight narrative is not sustained by a single piece of evidence. It survives through accumulation of loosely connected interpretations that never fully align into one definitive answer, and that is why it persists in public imagination, not as a confirmed object, but as a lingering uncertainty that keeps getting revisited. There's also something almost understated about how these kinds of stories evolve. They don't grow through dramatic revelations. They grow through repetition, a mention here, a reposted image there, a documentary segment that briefly revisits an old claim without fully resolving it. Each repetition adds a little weight. Not enough to confirm anything, but enough to keep it from disappearing. Meanwhile, the actual technical understanding of Earth's orbital environment has become far more precise. We now track thousands of objects, both active and inactive, moving through predictable and unpredictable paths. We understand reflections, signal delays, atmospheric interference, and the subtle distortions that can occur when data passes through layers of changing conditions. In that modern framework, most of the earlier anomalies find reasonable explanations. And yet, even with clarity available, the story does not fully dissolve. Because the Black Knight idea is no longer just about signals or images, it has become something slightly different over time, a kind of shared memory shaped by uncertainty itself, a reminder of a period when space was less mapped, less defined, and more open to interpretation. And maybe that is the part that keeps people returning to it, not the idea that something is definitively there, but the feeling that, at one point, not everything was fully understood. That there were moments when humanity was listening into space without knowing exactly how to interpret what came back, moments where silence and signal were not always clearly separate, and in that blurred space, stories naturally begin to form, not because they are needed, but because the mind rarely leaves emptiness untouched for long, and so the echoes remain in conversation, even now, not as proof of anything unusual in orbit, but as a trace of how uncertainty once sounded when it was first being heard. And slowly, that is where we will continue next. There are moments in history where an image is not just an image anymore. It becomes a question people keep returning to, even when they've already seen it a dozen times before. The photographs tied to the Black Knight satellite story sit exactly in that space, not clear enough to settle anything and not unclear enough to ignore, just suspended in that uncomfortable middle where interpretation starts to matter more than detail. In the early years of space photography, the cameras were not what we expect today. No sharp digital clarity, no stable resolution. Instead, there were film-based captures, grainy transmissions, and frames that often carried distortion from motion, radiation, or simple technical limitations. So when strange shapes appeared in those images, they were not immediately treated as mysteries. They were treated as imperfections, artifacts of the process, and most of them were dismissed as such. But the Black Knight narrative tends to focus on the few that didn't fade away so easily in public memory. One of the most commonly circulated ideas comes from a set of space shuttle mission images, where a dark, elongated shape appears against the backdrop of Earth. In some versions of the story, this is presented as an unknown object, something artificial, something not fully explained. But when those images are placed back into their original technical context, the interpretation becomes far less dramatic. What is often seen is consistent with thermal insulation material, lightweight foil-like sheets used to protect spacecraft. In microgravity, these materials don't behave like solid objects. They drift, twist, and reflect sunlight in ways that can look structured or intentional in a single frame. But a single frame is only a moment, and moments can be misleading, especially in space photography. Still, the image remains powerful in a psychological sense, because the human mind doesn't naturally process incomplete visual data as nothing. It tries to complete it. It assigns shape, direction, and meaning even when the original source does not support it. That is not a flaw in thinking. It is how perception works. And in cases like this, perception becomes part of the story itself. Over time, these images were shared, reposted, enhanced, and sometimes reinterpreted through digital filters that sharpened contrast or altered brightness. Each modification made the object appear slightly more defined than it originally was, not intentionally deceptive in most cases, just the natural result of trying to see more clearly. But clarity, when artificially increased, can sometimes create the illusion of structure where none was originally visible. This is one of the quiet reasons the Black Knight idea survived longer in public discussion than many similar anomalies, because it had visuals attached to it, even if those visuals were ambiguous. NASA and independent analysts have repeatedly pointed out that many of the images associated with this narrative align with known phenomena: debris from spacecraft, detached components, or reflective surfaces caught in sunlight. In orbit, even small fragments can appear large or structured, depending on angle and exposure. And yet, even with these explanations available, the images continue to circulate in contexts that remove them from their original mission data. Once that happens, something subtle shifts. The image is no longer evidence of a specific moment in a specific experiment. It becomes a standalone object, detached from time, detached from explanation, and that detachment allows interpretation to grow freely around it. There is another layer here that is often overlooked. Early space missions were not designed with public visual analysis in mind. Many images were captured for engineering or scientific documentation, not for high-resolution public viewing. That means they were never intended to be scrutinized as standalone mysteries, but once they enter public space, their original purpose becomes secondary. They become open objects of interpretation, and open objects tend to collect meaning over time. Some researchers who have revisited these images later have emphasized how easily visual noise can be mistaken for structure when viewed without full contextual data. A slight shadow, a compression artifact, or a motion blur can all produce shapes that feel deliberate. Especially when someone is already looking for something unusual. This is where expectation quietly shapes perception, not in an obvious way, but in a way that subtly guides attention towards certain features while ignoring others. And once attention locks onto a perceived pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it, even after explanation is provided. That is part of why discussions about the Black Knight images often feel unresolved, not because the data is incomplete, but because interpretation and explanation exist in different mental spaces. One is visual, the other is structural, and they don't always overlap cleanly. There were also cases where early enhancement attempts of satellite imagery introduced additional distortion. Before modern digital processing, image clarity was often improved through manual or semi-automated methods that could unintentionally exaggerate contrast edges. A faint shape could become darker, a soft edge could become sharper, and in that transformation, something ordinary could begin to look unfamiliar, not because it changed, but because it was re-rendered through different assumptions about what should be seen. This is important in understanding why the Black Knight story expanded beyond its original technical roots. It was not driven by a single discovery. It was driven by repeated reinterpretation of the same limited visual material. Each time the images were revisited, they carried slightly more narrative weight than before. And eventually, they stopped being treated as isolated artifacts. They became part of a larger idea, an idea that something might have been present in orbit long before it was officially acknowledged. But when you step back from that idea and return to the original mission data, the structure of explanation remains consistent. Most anomalies dissolve when full context is restored. Camera angle, lighting conditions, material properties, orbital debris behavior. All of these factors are enough to account for the visual irregularities that sparked speculation. And yet, even when explanation is sufficient, it does not always erase curiosity, because curiosity is not always about solving something. Sometimes it is about sitting near the edge of uncertainty long enough to feel its shape, and the Black Knight images exist exactly at that edge, not as proof of something hidden in orbit. but as a record of how easily incomplete visuals can evolve into layered interpretations when viewed across time, distance, and imagination. And slowly, as we move further into this story, that distinction becomes more important than the images themselves. There's a strange thing that happens when an image stops belonging to its original moment. It starts to drift, not physically, but in meaning. The Black Knight photographs, once separated from their mission logs and technical explanations, slowly began that kind of drift. People stopped asking only what they were and started asking what they might be if viewed differently. And that "if" is where the story quietly expands. In later discussions, especially online, the same images were often presented without their original captions or surrounding data. This matters more than it seems at first glance, because in scientific documentation, context is not decoration. It is everything. Without it, an image becomes open-ended, and open-ended things rarely stay still for long. One of the most repeated claims tied to these visuals is that the object appears too structured to be natural debris. That phrase appears again and again in different forms: too symmetrical, too deliberate, too stable in shape. But space does not treat structure the way human eyes expect it to behave. A torn thermal blanket can hold folds that resemble geometry when light hits it from a specific angle. A rotating fragment can briefly align with a camera frame in a way that looks intentional. Even compression artifacts in early digital transmissions can create edges that were never physically present. And all of this becomes more important when you realize something simple. Most of these images are not continuous recordings. They are single captured moments, a fraction of time without what came before or after. And a fraction of time is rarely enough to understand motion in space. This is where interpretation begins to quietly override observation, not because people are careless, but because the human mind prefers continuity. It prefers to believe that what it sees in one frame reflects something stable and ongoing. So it fills in the missing frames automatically, without asking. In the Black Knight case, that filling-in process became amplified over years of repetition. Each retelling added slight adjustments, a darker contrast here, a clearer outline there. A suggestion that the object was seen again in another mission, even when those connections were not technically verified in the original data. And slowly, the narrative stopped depending on any single image at all. It became self-supporting. The images were now evidence of the idea, rather than the origin of it. NASA's position, when examined across decades of statements and technical clarifications, remains consistent in tone even when language changes. Most of the objects identified in these discussions are explained through known categories: debris, insulation, structural fragments, or optical distortions caused by lighting conditions in orbit. What is often missing from public perception is how routine such identifications actually are. Space missions generate thousands of visual anomalies. The vast majority are resolved quickly because they fit into known physical behavior once full data is available. But those resolutions rarely become part of public memory. What stays in memory are the unresolved feeling ones, even if they were resolved. There is a subtle imbalance here. Explanation tends to be quiet, speculation tends to be memorable, so over time, memory itself becomes uneven. This is one of the reasons the Black Knight narrative feels more persistent than the data behind it would suggest, not because the data is missing, but because the explanation doesn't circulate with the same emotional weight as the question. Another factor that shaped the longevity of this story is the early internet era. When archival images and fragmented mission references began appearing in forums and early discussion boards, they were often shared without full technical context. People would encounter an image first, an explanation much later, if at all. That order matters, because the first impression tends to anchor interpretation. Once an object is seen as unknown, later information has to work against that initial framing, and that is not an easy correction to make in collective perception. Over time, small reinterpretations accumulated. A satellite photograph here, a blurred frame there. A suggestion that multiple missions had seen the same object, even when those claims were based on loosely connected or misaligned data points. None of these additions required intentional fabrication. They often emerged from genuine confusion, miscommunication, or simple lack of access to full archives. But the effect was the same. The narrative expanded beyond its original material, and once that happens, a story no longer depends entirely on evidence to continue existing. It begins to depend on familiarity. People recognize it, they reference it, they repeat it in slightly different forms. And repetition gives it structure even when structure was never clearly present at the beginning. Still, when you return to the actual technical environment of those missions, something grounding becomes clear. Space is not empty, but it is explainable in layers that are often unfamiliar to the general imagination. Light behaves differently. Objects drift in ways that defy earthbound intuition. Materials reflect and fold in unexpected ways. And cameras, especially early ones, were never perfect observers. They were tools operating at the edge of human understanding at the time. So when something appears unusual in that environment, the first question in scientific practice is not, what is it really? But what conditions could have produced this appearance? In almost every examined case related to the Black Knight imagery, those conditions exist. That does not erase curiosity. But it does anchor interpretation back into physical reality, and maybe that is where this part of the story naturally settles, not in proving or disproving something hidden in orbit, but in recognizing how easily visual fragments, when removed from their full context, can evolve into something much larger than they originally were, something that feels like it is still up there, even when the evidence points elsewhere. And in that quiet tension between image and interpretation, the story continues to linger, not because it is unresolved, but because it was never contained in a single frame to begin with. There's a point where every story about space quietly shifts its weight. It stops being about what was seen and starts becoming about what was believed while it was being seen. The Black Knight narrative reaches that point slowly, almost without notice. By the time it starts being discussed more widely, it is no longer just tied to photographs or radio echoes. It begins to sit inside a larger question that has nothing to do with a single object. It becomes a question about silence itself, about what space is supposed to contain and what it might conceal without ever announcing it. But when you go back to the official responses, the tone is different, much more grounded, much less uncertain than public discussion tends to suggest. NASA and other space agencies involved in early orbital tracking never treated the so-called black night as a single verified object. Instead, when similar claims were revisited over time, the explanations consistently pointed toward known categories of orbital material: detached insulation, upper stage rocket fragments, small debris fields that behave unpredictably when sunlight hits them at certain angles. None of this was presented as speculation in the scientific sense. It was based on repeated observation and cross-referenced mission data, and that is something important to hold onto here, because in space operations, identification is not based on appearance alone. It is based on trajectory, timing, signal consistency, and correlation with known launches. The shape in a photograph is never enough by itself to define an object's origin. It is only a starting point, but in public interpretation, that starting point often becomes the entire story. There were also early moments in satellite communication history where signal irregularities were genuinely confusing, even to experts. The science of long-distance radio reflection through Earth's ionosphere was still developing. Scientists were actively learning how signals could bend, delay, and return in ways that did not match initial expectations. So when unusual echoes were recorded, they were investigated through that lens first. Atmospheric reflection models, equipment calibration issues, timing delays in transmission chains, and in most cases, those explanations were sufficient once full system data was reviewed. But there is a subtle gap between explained technically and understood intuitively. In that gap is where public mystery tends to form, because technical resolution does not always translate into narrative closure. A solved equation can still feel open-ended if the explanation is not widely internalized. Over time, this gap widened in the Black Knight story, especially as media coverage began to reframe older technical notes into more speculative summaries. A delayed signal becomes unexplained transmission. A piece of debris becomes unknown object. A blurred image becomes mysterious structure. The language shifts just enough to change emotional impact, even when the underlying data remains unchanged. And once language shifts, perception follows. There were also documented cases where unrelated space objects were later mistakenly grouped into the same narrative due to visual similarity or timing coincidence. In orbital environments, multiple missions overlap in the same general space region, and tracking artifacts can appear near one another in ways that seem connected when they are not. This is one of the most common sources of misinterpretation in early space imagery analysis: clustering of unrelated data points. The human brain is highly sensitive to clustering. It interprets proximity as relationship, even when none exists. So when multiple anomalies appear across different missions or time periods, it becomes easy to mentally group them into a single storyline. And once grouped, they start reinforcing each other. Each new mention feels like confirmation of the previous one, even if the underlying data never actually converges. NASA's archival clarifications on similar topics tend to follow a consistent pattern. They do not dismiss curiosity, but they emphasize context. That context includes the known density of orbital debris, the limitations of early imaging technology, and the evolving nature of tracking systems over decades. One of the quieter points often made in technical discussions is that space is not visually clean. It is not a blank stage where only large, intentional objects appear. It is filled with countless small fragments that reflect light unpredictably. Many of them are invisible most of the time. Some become visible only under specific lighting and camera conditions. And those moments can look unusual if taken out of context. This is where the black night images return again, not as anomalies in isolation, but as examples of how ordinary orbital material can appear unfamiliar when seen without supporting data. There's also something worth noticing in how human attention behaves in these situations. When a story already exists in cultural memory, new information is not always evaluated neutrally. It is filtered through what is already familiar. So even when an image is explained, the explanation has to compete with the existing narrative structure in people's minds, and that structure is often more emotionally stable than the technical correction. That does not mean people reject explanation. It means explanation and narrative often operate in different layers of understanding. One is factual, the other is interpretive, and they don't always merge cleanly. Over time, this separation allowed the Black Knight idea to remain present even as official explanations stayed consistent, not as a confirmed object, but as a recurring interpretive pattern that reappears whenever ambiguous space imagery is discussed. And in that sense, the story is less about a satellite and more about how ambiguity behaves when it is repeatedly observed across time. Not everything unclear becomes a mystery, but some unclear things are repeatedly treated as one, and that repetition, more than any single image or signal, is what gives the narrative its persistence. So as we move forward into the next part of this, the focus slowly begins to shift away from what was seen and toward why certain uncertainties stay alive even after they are explained. There's a moment in almost every long-running mystery where explanation is no longer the main issue. The issue becomes what explanation does to the feeling of the story, because technically, a lot of the Black Knight discussion has answers attached to it: debris behavior, imaging artifacts, signal reflection in early radio systems, even simple misinterpretations that came from viewing incomplete data. But even when those answers are available, something in the narrative doesn't fully settle. It doesn't collapse, it just shifts shape. And that shift is important, because what people are often reacting to is not a single claim that something unknown is in orbit. It is the accumulation of small uncertainties that, over time, start to feel connected. NASA's position across decades has remained fairly consistent when stripped down to its core message. There is no verified evidence of a non-human or unidentified structured object orbiting Earth matching the descriptions associated with the Black Knight story. But that kind of statement doesn't always interact cleanly with public imagination. Not because it is unclear, but because it is final. And finality can feel uncomfortable when a story has been built around open-ended interpretation. So instead, the narrative continues in parallel. One track is technical, grounded in orbital mechanics, tracking systems, and known physical phenomena. The other track is interpretive, built from images, anecdotes, and recycled fragments of earlier speculation. They don't fully merge, they coexist. In the technical track, explanations become more refined over time. As satellite tracking improved, as imaging resolution increased, and as space debris catalogs expanded, many of the earlier unknowns found natural classification. Objects that once seemed ambiguous were later matched with known missions or debris fields. This process is normal in any evolving field of observation. Early uncertainty gradually gets absorbed into structured knowledge, but the interpretive track doesn't always update at the same pace. It preserves the earlier version of uncertainty, and sometimes that version becomes the more familiar one. There is also something subtle about how unknown behaves in public discussion. It doesn't always mean unexplained in a technical sense. Sometimes it simply means not widely understood at the moment of first encounter. And once something is labeled as unknown in that emotional sense, it tends to retain that label even after explanation arrives later. This is part of why the Black Knight idea persists in circulation, not because it resists explanation, but because it was introduced to many people before explanation was ever part of the experience. Another layer that often gets overlooked is how early space imagery itself conditions interpretation. Grainy textures, motion blur, high contrast lighting, and limited frame rates all contribute to a visual environment where ambiguity is common. In such conditions, the mind doesn't just see what is there. It actively constructs continuity. A shadow becomes a shape. A reflection becomes an object. A fragment becomes something whole, and once that construction is made, it feels visually real, even if the original data does not support that structure consistently across frames. This is not a flaw in perception. It is how perception maintains coherence in incomplete environments. But in the context of space imagery, it creates a natural overlap between real physical artifacts and interpreted structure. That overlap is where most misunderstandings originate. NASA's technical responses over the years have repeatedly emphasized this point in different forms. The orbital environment is filled with reflective, irregular, and transient objects. Without full trajectory data and multi-angle observation, single-frame interpretation is inherently limited. That limitation is not hidden. It is a known constraint of observational science. But again, constraints are not always emotionally satisfying. Because a constraint explains why certainty is difficult, not why uncertainty feels meaningful. And meaning is often what people are actually engaging with in stories like this. The idea that something might be out there is less about evidence and more about the psychological space that evidence leaves open when it is incomplete or indirect, even when that space is small, even when it is already filled by known explanations. There's also a historical rhythm to this kind of narrative. Early satellite-era communication was a time of rapid expansion in capability, but not always in clarity. Systems were being built faster than long-term understanding could stabilize, so naturally, anomalies were part of the learning process. Most were resolved internally and never entered public discourse. But a few, due to timing or visibility, escaped into wider discussion before full context could follow them. Once that happens, the story no longer belongs only to technical archives. It becomes part of public memory. And public memory does not always update in the same way technical documentation does. it tends to preserve the version that first made emotional sense. That is why, even with consistent official explanations, the Black Knight narrative continues to reappear in documentaries, discussions, and online forums. Not as a confirmed object, but as a recurring example of how early space data can be reinterpreted when removed from its original technical frame. And as we step back from all of this, something fairly simple remains at the center. There is no verified evidence of a structured, persistent object in orbit matching the descriptions tied to this story. What exists instead is a collection of observations that were, at different times, ambiguous, context-dependent, or later resolved through improved understanding. But those observations, once separated from their context, became something else in public imagination, something that feels continuous, even when the underlying data is not. And that is where this part of the story naturally settles, not in discovery, not in confirmation, but in the space between what was observed and what was later understood, a space that, once entered, is difficult for stories to fully leave. There's a point where the conversation about space stops feeling like it's about technology at all. It starts feeling like it's about distance. Not just physical distance, but the distance between what we measure and what we assume we understand from those measurements. That is where Chapter 4 quietly begins, not with a new discovery and not with a dramatic shift in evidence, but with something much more ordinary: repetition. In the Black Knight narrative, one of the recurring ideas is that signals were heard again, or echoed, in ways that seemed too consistent to be random. The word echo itself becomes important here because it carries two meanings at once. In physics, it is a reflection of a signal. In human thinking, it is something that returns with familiarity, and those two meanings start blending over time. In early radio science, signal reflection was not unusual. Earth's ionosphere behaves like a shifting mirror for certain frequencies. It bends, delays, and returns transmissions depending on atmospheric conditions, solar activity, and even time of day. This is well documented and still studied, but in the early days of experimentation, that behavior was not fully intuitive. Sometimes a signal would return later than expected. Sometimes it would appear weaker or distorted in ways that didn't immediately match prediction models available at the time. And in those moments, engineers were not dealing with mystery in the dramatic sense. They were dealing with incomplete calibration. There is a subtle difference there that matters. Incomplete calibration does not mean unknown phenomenon. It means known physics operating under not yet perfect understanding. But from the outside, both can look similar if you only see the result and not the process. This is one of the quiet foundations of the Black Knight story. Not a single unexplained event, but a chain of technically explainable ones that were not fully understood at the moment they occurred. And later, when those fragments are revisited without their original technical context, they can appear more unusual than they actually were. There is another layer to this involving how signals travel in space. Unlike sound in air, radio waves do not behave in a simple linear way when they interact with Earth's atmospheric layers and the surrounding electromagnetic environment. They can scatter. They can reflect off different ionospheric densities. They can even bounce multiple times under certain conditions, creating delayed returns that feel unexpected if you are only anticipating a single direct path. In modern systems, these behaviors are accounted for in detail, but in early systems, they were still being mapped. So when operators recorded irregular returns, they were often witnessing known physics operating in conditions that were not yet fully characterized. Over time, models improved, prediction improved, and what once felt irregular became predictable within expanded frameworks. But here is where the narrative split begins to matter again. Because while technical understanding evolved, the earlier recorded anomalies remained documented in simplified form in public-facing summaries. And simplified summaries, when detached from full technical explanation, tend to preserve only the unusual part, not the resolution. So a delayed signal becomes unexplained echo. A distorted return becomes unknown reflection. The temporary anomaly becomes persistent irregularity. Language compresses the story, and compression changes perception. In parallel, the Black Knight imagery continues to circulate alongside these signal discussions, even though they are not technically connected in any verified scientific framework. But in public interpretation, they often merge because they share a common emotional category, things in space that were not immediately understood. That shared category is what binds them together in narrative form, not evidence, association. There is also something important about how repetition shapes belief over time. If a concept appears often enough in different contexts, radio signals, photographs, mission discussions, it begins to feel like a single continuous thread, even if the original sources are unrelated. The mind prefers continuity over fragmentation, so it connects dots even when the spacing between those dots is irregular. And once that connection feels stable, it becomes part of memory structure rather than active reasoning. NASA's consistent position on these matters remains grounded in data interpretation and orbital tracking systems that have become extremely precise over decades. Objects in Earth's orbit are now cataloged, tracked, and continuously updated in public and private databases. What was once ambiguous in early decades is now largely classifiable. That does not erase earlier uncertainty, but it does reframe it. What looked like mystery at the time of observation often becomes data noise once full system understanding is available. And noise, by definition, is not structured information. It is background variation within a known system. Still, even with that clarity, older anomalies retain narrative weight because they belong to a time when systems were less complete, and incomplete systems leave more room for interpretation. This is where Chapter 4 quietly shifts its focus, away from the idea of something out there in orbit, and towards something more grounded, the behavior of information itself, how it travels, how it is recorded, how it is simplified, and how, over time, simplification can reshape the way entire events are remembered. Because in the end, the Black Knight narrative is not sustained by a single signal or a single image. It is sustained by the way those fragments were carried forward, repeated, and gradually separated from their original technical environment, not as deception, but as transformation. And that transformation is what we will continue exploring next. There's a strange softness to the way information changes over time. It doesn't break loudly. It doesn't collapse in one obvious moment. It just shifts quietly. And once it shifts enough times, you stop noticing where the original shape used to be. That is what happens when early space data is carried forward into public memory without its full technical environment attached to it. By the time the Black Knight narrative becomes widely discussed, the original context of most referenced events has already been thinned down. What remains are fragments, a mention of a signal, a blurred image, a summary of an anomaly that once had pages of technical reasoning behind it. But those pages rarely travel with the fragment, so what survives is the outline, not the explanation, and outlines are easy to reshape. In radio communication theory, there is a simple idea that helps ground all of this. Signals are never isolated from their environment. They are always interacting with something: atmosphere, hardware, distance, noise, reflection paths, even timing synchronization errors between systems. So when something appears off, the first step is not interpretation, it is reconstruction of conditions. What was the system doing at that exact moment? What was the environment like? What else was happening along the signal path? In early space tracking systems, these questions often took time to answer fully, not because the data was missing, but because it was distributed across multiple sources and had to be cross-checked manually or semi-manually in many cases. That delay between observation and full understanding is where uncertainty lives, and uncertainty, once noticed, tends to linger longer than the resolution that eventually follows it. In the Black Knight discussions, this dynamic becomes visible in how different pieces of information are remembered. The signal reports are remembered as unusual. The explanations are remembered as less interesting. Even when the explanations are more complete, this imbalance is not unusual in how humans process complex technical history. We naturally prioritize irregularity over resolution because irregularity signals attention. It interrupts expectation. Resolution, on the other hand, restores normality. And normality is less likely to be remembered in detail. So over time, the memory of the system becomes skewed toward the moments of disruption, not because they were more important, but because they were more noticeable. There's also a technical layer here that often gets simplified in public retellings. In orbital environments, objects do not exist in clean isolation. Even small debris can produce unpredictable visual and electromagnetic effects depending on lighting, velocity, and observation angle. A fragment rotating slowly in sunlight can appear stable for a few seconds of observation, then completely change appearance as its orientation shifts. If captured in a single frame, that object freezes into a false sense of structure, but in motion, it tells a different story entirely. This is one of the core reasons why early space imagery required careful multi-frame analysis rather than single-image interpretation. And when that multi-frame context is missing in later circulation of the same image, interpretation fills the gap, not intentionally, but naturally. The same applies to radio signals. A delayed reflection in one instance might be recorded as anomalous if viewed alone, but when placed into a broader data set, it often aligns with known reflection behavior under specific ionospheric conditions. So again, context dissolves anomaly, but only if context is present. Without it, the anomaly remains standing on its own, and that is exactly how the Black Knight narrative persists in modern discussion spaces. not because there is a single unresolved technical event at its core, but because the original technical environment is no longer fully present in most retellings. There is another subtle factor that plays into this as well. Human storytelling prefers continuity. If multiple unusual events are discussed in proximity, the mind tends to connect them into a single thread of meaning, even if those events were originally unrelated in time, system, or cause. This is not a flaw in thinking. It is an efficiency mechanism. The brain reduces complexity by grouping similar patterns together, but in scientific contexts, that grouping can create misleading associations. A signal anomaly from one mission period can become mentally linked to an unrelated visual artifact from another mission, simply because both fall under the category of space unknowns. Once grouped, they begin to reinforce each other in memory, and reinforcement gives them narrative stability. NASA's approach when revisiting these kinds of claims consistently relies on separation of events. Each anomaly is analyzed within its own data set, its own mission parameters, its own environmental conditions. And in that isolated framework, explanations tend to be consistent with known physics and engineering behavior. But public narratives do not always maintain that separation. They merge, and once merged, they become harder to disentangle without revisiting original technical documentation, which most people never see. So the merged version becomes the dominant version, not because it is more accurate, but because it is more accessible. And accessibility often determines memory more than precision does. As this chapter begins to settle, what remains is not a single object in orbit or a single unexplained signal. What remains is a pattern in how information changes when it moves from technical systems into public interpretation. A pattern where context gradually fades and fragments take on independent meaning, and once that happens enough times, a story can exist even without a stable foundation beneath it, not as truth, not as fabrication, but as a layered reinterpretation of incomplete moments that were never meant to stand alone in the first place. And from here, the narrative naturally turns inward again, toward how people relate to uncertainty itself. There's something almost quiet about the way people carry mysteries with them. They don't always talk about them directly. Most of the time, they don't even realize they're doing it. A fragment of an image stays somewhere in the background of thought, a half-remembered claim about something in orbit, a late-night video they once watched and didn't fully question at the time. And over the years, those fragments don't disappear. They settle. Chapter 5 begins there, not with new data, but with the human habit of keeping unfinished ideas alive longer than expected. When the Black Knight narrative started appearing more frequently outside technical circles, it wasn't through official channels. It wasn't introduced as a confirmed phenomenon. It spread through discussion spaces where curiosity matters more than classification. Forums, early online communities, reposted articles, speculative breakdowns of old images. Each place added something slightly different, not necessarily new information, but new framing. One post might present it as an unidentified object reportedly seen in multiple missions. Another might focus on delayed signals from early space tracking experiments. Another would simply show an image without explanation, letting interpretation do the rest. And slowly, those different angles started converging in people's minds into a single narrative shape, even though they didn't originate from a single source. This is where the human part of the story becomes more important than the technical one. Because once information leaves structured environments like mission logs and enters open discussion spaces, it stops behaving like controlled data. It becomes conversational, flexible, rewritten in small ways with each retelling, and each retelling carries intention, even if subtle. Sometimes it's curiosity, sometimes it's entertainment. Sometimes it's genuine confusion about what is known and what is still uncertain, but the result is the same. The story evolves. In early internet discussions, one of the strongest drivers of this evolution was simply accessibility. Original technical explanations were often buried in archives, written in language that assumed prior knowledge of orbital mechanics, signal processing, or spacecraft design. Meanwhile, simplified summaries circulated more widely, and simplicity tends to travel faster than accuracy in large information networks. So the simplified version became the familiar version. Over time, certain phrases started appearing repeatedly in connection with the Black Knight idea: unknown object, persistent satellite, unexplained orbiting presence. These phrases often came from reinterpretations of earlier material rather than original documentation, but repetition gives them weight, even when their origin is indirect. There is also something important about timing in how these narratives grow. The Black Knight idea gained more visibility during a period when public interest in space was increasing again, especially with renewed satellite launches, documentaries, and online discussions about historical missions. Whenever attention returns to space, older ambiguous stories tend to resurface alongside it, not because they are newly relevant, but because they already exist in the background of public memory, waiting for reactivation. And once reactivated, they are rarely rechecked against full technical context unless someone actively goes looking for it. Most people don't. They encounter the story in its already formed version. That version feels complete enough on its own, even if it is. Another layer that shaped this narrative is the emotional structure of unresolved ideas. A fully explained event tends to close itself. It reaches a point where curiosity naturally fades because the system of understanding is complete, but an partially understood event behaves differently. It leaves space open. And that space can be revisited repeatedly without ever feeling fully exhausted. The Black Knight narrative exists in that open space, not because it resists explanation in technical terms, but because explanation does not always close emotional curiosity, and emotional curiosity is what sustains repetition. In discussions where people explored this topic, you can often see two parallel behaviors happening at once. One group leans toward technical clarification, pointing toward known orbital debris, imaging artifacts, and signal behavior. Another group leans toward reinterpretation, revisiting the same images or reports with different framing, looking for continuity across scattered data points. Neither group is necessarily acting irrationally. They are engaging with different layers of the same material. One layer is structural, the other is interpretive. And those layers do not always resolve into a single perspective. NASA's role in this kind of narrative is often misunderstood in public retellings. Official statements about space objects are typically not designed to engage with speculative frameworks. They are designed to classify, identify, and explain within established scientific models. So when something is categorized as debris or artifact, it is not a dismissal of curiosity. It is an assignment of known behavior within a system that has been extensively studied. But outside that system, classification doesn't always carry emotional closure, because classification answers, what is it? But curiosity often wants to answer, why did it feel unknown in the first place? And those are not the same question. As Chapter 5 continues, the focus slowly shifts away from whether the Black Knight object exists as described in public imagination, and toward why narratives like this form so easily around partial information. Because once you look closely, the pattern repeats across many unrelated topics in science and exploration. A small set of ambiguous observations, a period of limited understanding, later reinterpretation without full context, and then gradual narrative expansion through repetition. The Black Knight story is one instance of that pattern, not an exception to it, and understanding that pattern doesn't remove curiosity. It simply changes where the curiosity is directed, not upward toward a supposed object in orbit, but backward toward how human understanding builds meaning from incomplete signals in the first place. And that is where we pause for now. There's a point in every long discussion where the story stops growing outward and starts circling back on itself, not because there is nothing left to say, but because the same pieces begin to appear in different combinations. Chapter 5 moves into that space now. The Black Knight narrative, once it spread through online communities and informal discussions, started to behave less like a single idea and more like a shared reference point. People didn't always agree on what it was, but they often recognized the shape of it immediately. An unknown object. A strange signal, an image that couldn't be fully explained. And that recognition matters more than the details, because recognition is what allows a story to survive even when its original context fades. In many early discussions, what kept the narrative alive wasn't new evidence, but reinterpretation of old material through slightly different emotional framing. A technical explanation would appear, and then be reframed in simpler language. A classified satellite fragment would be described as mysterious debris. A signal reflection would become unusual transmission behavior. Each step doesn't necessarily distort the facts on its own, but together they gradually shift the tone, and tone is often what people remember most. There is also a subtle effect that happens when multiple explanations exist side by side. Instead of closing uncertainty, they can sometimes extend it in public perception. One explanation feels too technical, another feels too vague, a third feels incomplete without full data access. So rather than settling the question, the presence of multiple explanations can unintentionally keep the question open in the background. Not in scientific terms, but in conversational memory, and that is where the Black Knight idea continues to circulate, not as a single claim, but as a cluster of related interpretations that never fully converge into one agreed definition. As this pattern repeats across discussions, something else begins to form around it, a sense of continuity, even though the original data points were never continuous. This is where human storytelling naturally steps in. The mind prefers linking fragments into a sequence rather than holding them separately. So scattered events across different missions, different time periods, and different technical contexts begin to feel like they belong to one unfolding thread, even when they don't. And once that thread is established, it becomes easier to add to it. New interpretations don't need to originate from new data. They can attach themselves to existing structure, a new image, a new mention, a resurfaced article. Each one is placed into the same mental framework, reinforcing the idea that they are part of a larger, ongoing phenomenon. This is not a deliberate process. It is how narrative memory works under conditions of incomplete information. NASA's archival clarifications and technical documentation continue to address these kinds of interpretations by separating events into their original contexts. A debris fragment is tied to its mission. A signal anomaly is tied to its atmospheric conditions. An imaging artifact is tied to its capture environment. In that structured view, each piece becomes self-contained, and most of the ambiguity dissolves when placed back into its correct frame. But public narratives do not always preserve that separation. They flatten it. So instead of multiple independent explanations, what remains in memory is a single blended category, unexplained space phenomena. And once that category forms, it becomes self-sustaining, because anything that feels unfamiliar in space can be loosely attached to it. There's also a psychological layer that quietly supports this persistence. Unresolved ideas tend to stay emotionally active longer than resolved ones. A completed explanation ends curiosity, but an incomplete or partially understood idea keeps attention available in the background. The Black Knight narrative sits in that background space for many people, not actively believed as fact, but not fully dismissed either, just stored, occasionally revisited when similar topics appear. That occasional revisiting is enough to keep it culturally alive, even if no new evidence is added. Even if official explanations remain unchanged, there is another important aspect that emerges when you step back from individual claims and look at the broader pattern. Most long-running space-related mysteries share a similar structure. They begin with a limited data set, often from early exploration phases. They gain ambiguity due to technological constraints of the time. They are later reinterpreted outside their original context. And finally, they become part of broader speculative narratives that outgrow their initial scope. The Black Knight idea follows that structure closely, which suggests something important. Its persistence is not necessarily tied to a unique object or phenomenon. It is tied to a repeatable pattern in how human understanding evolves around incomplete information. And that pattern appears across many fields, not just space observation. At this stage in the story, what remains is less about identifying what was in orbit and more about understanding how interpretation itself travels, how it shifts, how it merges, and how it continues even when the original uncertainty has already been addressed within its technical framework. Because once a narrative becomes familiar enough, it no longer depends on the presence of new data to continue existing. It only depends on repetition. And repetition, once established, is one of the most stable forces in collective memory. So as Chapter 5 gently closes, the focus doesn't land on a conclusion about the Black Night itself. It settles instead on something quieter, the realization that some stories persist not because they remain unresolved, but because they were built from fragments that were never meant to be seen as a single whole in the first place. And that is where we pause again. The Cold War wasn't just a political period, it was a technical acceleration point. Everything tied to space during that time moved faster than understanding could fully stabilize. Satellites were being launched, tracked, and analyzed in real time, often while the systems used to understand them were still being refined. Different agencies were building overlapping methods of observation, sometimes without full integration between data sets. That alone creates space for confusion, not mystery in the dramatic sense, but gaps in shared visibility. And those gaps matter more than they seem at first, because when systems don't fully overlap, interpretation fills the space between them. The Black Knight narrative often gets loosely placed into this era, not because there is verified evidence of a specific object originating from Cold War programs, but because the atmosphere of that time supports the idea of hidden complexity. Classified projects were real. Satellite programs were sensitive. Tracking capabilities were evolving. A lot of what was happening above Earth was not immediately visible to the public. So when later, ambiguous reports surfaced, old radio anomalies, unclear photographic fragments, they were easily absorbed into that historical backdrop, not because they belonged there, but because it felt consistent with it. During that period, space surveillance was also becoming more structured. Radar tracking networks were expanding. Optical observation systems were improving. Data was being cross-referenced across stations more frequently than before. But even with that progress, early datasets still carried inconsistencies simply because the systems themselves were not fully mature. Small timing mismatches, signal-noise misclassification, incomplete trajectory reconstruction. These aren't dramatic failures. They are normal growing pains of a system still learning how to observe its own environment. And yet, when viewed decades later without that context, those same inconsistencies can feel more significant than they originally were. Especially when they are extracted from their original technical reports and placed into simplified summaries. That's where perception begins to drift again, because Cold War-era secrecy creates a psychological environment where people are already primed to expect hidden layers. Even when most satellite data was and is eventually declassified, the idea that something might still be missing tends to persist in cultural memory, not because of evidence, but because of the structure of the era itself. In reality, most orbital tracking during that time was focused on identifying known objects and maintaining catalog accuracy. When unknowns appeared, they were investigated, categorized, or later matched with known launches or debris sources. The system wasn't designed around mystery. It was designed around classification. But classification is not the same thing as public explanation, and that gap between internal resolution and external understanding is where long-lived narratives often form. The Black Knight idea benefits from that gap, not by proving anything specific, but by existing in the space where older technical uncertainty and later public reinterpretation overlap. When you look closely at how these discussions evolved, something subtle becomes clear. The narrative didn't grow from one central piece of evidence. It grew from repeated association of unrelated anomalies that shared only one thing in common. They were not immediately understood by non-specialist audiences at the time they were first mentioned publicly. That is a very specific condition. And it's enough to generate narrative cohesion even without direct connection between the events themselves. So over time, Cold War secrecy, early satellite tracking limitations, and fragmented public documentation all blended into a single interpretive backdrop. And within that backdrop, the Black Knight story feels like it belongs, even though it was never anchored to a confirmed object in official records. NASA and other space agencies, when addressing similar historical claims, tend to separate technological history from interpretive narratives very clearly. They focus on what the systems were capable of at the time, what data was recorded, and how later analysis aligns with known physical behavior. In that framework, most of the anomalies tied to the Black Knight discussion fall into well-understood categories of debris identification, signal behavior, or imaging interpretation errors. But clarity in technical terms does not always translate into narrative closure, because narratives are not built only from data. They are built from how that data is remembered, shared, and reinterpreted over time. And Cold War-era space history provides a particularly strong environment for that kind of reinterpretation because so much of it was, by necessity, technical, classified, or simply not designed for public consumption in real time. So when fragments of that history eventually entered public discussion, they often arrived without full scaffolding, just pieces, and pieces are always easier to rearrange than complete structures. As this chapter continues, the focus slowly shifts away from whether secrecy implies hidden objects and towards something more grounded. How incomplete visibility naturally produces interpretive space, and how that space, once created, rarely remains empty for long. It begins to fill itself, not with evidence, but with narrative continuity, and that is where we move next. Cold War secrecy didn't create the Black Knight story, but it did something quieter and more important to it. It created atmosphere, a kind of background pressure where anything incomplete felt like it might belong to something larger than what was officially visible. And when that atmosphere exists long enough, even ordinary gaps in data start to feel meaningful. That is where Chapter 6 settles now, not on hidden satellites or confirmed anomalies, but on how absence of full information slowly becomes something people interpret as presence. During the Cold War era, space observation systems were improving rapidly, but they were still fragmented across different institutions, countries, and technical frameworks. One group might track an object using radar signatures, while another relied on optical confirmation, and another on early computational orbit prediction models. These systems didn't always speak to each other in real time, so what one system labeled clearly, another might only partially resolve. And partial resolution is where ambiguity lives, but here is something important that often gets lost in later retellings. Ambiguity inside a technical system is not the same as mystery. It is usually just a temporary state before more data arrives. However, when that temporary state becomes visible outside its original system, when it enters public discussion without full resolution history, it can appear more significant than it actually was. This is one of the core reasons Cold War-era satellite discussions became fertile ground for reinterpretation later on, not because the data was hiding something unusual, but because the data was never designed to be consumed as narrative in the first place. It was operational, functional, fragmented by necessity. And when fragments enter storytelling environments, they naturally start forming patterns that were never part of the original structure. The Black Knight idea exists in that transformation zone, where technical fragments meet narrative reconstruction. There were also practical reasons why early satellite data sometimes felt inconsistent when viewed later without context. Tracking accuracy improved over time, but early systems had limited resolution and relied heavily on manual verification steps. Orbital predictions were updated as new observations came in, meaning earlier projections were often superseded without being fully removed from archived summaries. So if someone looks back at partial records without following the full revision chain, they may encounter data that feels incomplete or uncertain. Not because it was unknown at the time, but because it was later refined, and refinement often erases the visible trace of earlier uncertainty. That absence of visible correction can be misread as unresolved mystery. In parallel, the broader Cold War environment encouraged a mindset where classified programs were assumed to be extensive and deeply layered. And while many programs were indeed classified for national security reasons, most of them followed very specific operational goals: communication, reconnaissance, tracking, and defense monitoring. None of these categories require unknown orbiting structures to function, but public imagination tends to extend the unknown beyond what is documented, especially when documentation is partial or delayed in release. This is where narratives like Black Knight become stable, not through confirmation, but through interpretive expansion around incomplete historical visibility. Over time, the story becomes less about specific signals or images and more about a general sense that something from early space history might still not be fully accounted for. That feeling is powerful, even when it is not tied to any specific data set, because it operates emotionally, not technically, and emotional persistence is often stronger than technical correction in public memory. NASA's historical clarifications on orbital objects, debris, and early mission artifacts consistently point back to known categories of explanation, but those explanations exist in technical language, tied to engineering frameworks that don't always translate into narrative simplicity. So there is always a translation gap. On one side, precise classification. On the other, simplified interpretation, and between them, stories that form themselves in the absence of direct alignment. The Black Knight narrative sits almost entirely in that middle space, not anchored in verified anomaly, not fully erased by explanation, just repeatedly reinterpreted through partial visibility. As Chapter 6 begins to close, what becomes clearer is that Cold War secrecy is not the source of the mystery. It is the environment that allowed fragments of technical uncertainty to be separated from their resolution paths. Once that separation happens, the fragments gain independence. They no longer belong to their original systems. They belong to interpretation, and interpretation, once established, tends to evolve on its own schedule, not tied to archives, not tied to updates, only tied to how often the fragments are revisited and reassembled in conversation. And that is where we pause for now. The story is already carrying a kind of weight it didn't start with. Not because anything new has been added recently, but because the same ideas have been looked at from so many angles that they start to feel denser than they actually are. So this is where things slow down again. Not to explain away the mystery, and not to reinforce it either, just to return to the physical layer underneath everything that has been discussed so far, space itself. When people talk about objects in orbit, especially in stories like the Black Knight narrative, there is often an unspoken assumption that space is still, quiet, empty in a way that feels almost absolute, but real orbital space is nothing like that. It is active, constantly shifting, filled with motion that is predictable only when you are looking at it through the right kind of models. There are thousands of tracked objects orbiting Earth at any given time. Active satellites, defunct satellites, rocket stages, fragmented debris from old missions. Even small material pieces that are too minor to track consistently but still exist within orbital paths, and all of them are moving at extreme velocities. This alone changes how perception works. Because at those speeds, even tiny objects can appear visually significant when light hits them at the right angle. A reflective surface, even something as thin as insulation material, can momentarily appear structured or solid when captured in a single frame of reference, not because it is structured, but because the conditions briefly allow it to look that way. This is one of the core realities that often gets lost when space imagery is taken out of its operational context. A single image does not represent stability. It represents a moment of alignment between object, light source, and camera position. And in orbital environments, those alignments are constantly changing. So what appears unusual in one frame may look completely unremarkable a few seconds later from a slightly different angle. This is also why multi-frame analysis is essential in orbital observation. One image can mislead the mind into assuming permanence. Multiple images restore motion, and motion removes illusion of structure. The Black Knight images that circulate in public discussion often do not come with that full sequence. They appear as isolated moments, removed from surrounding frames that would normally show movement, rotation, or environmental context. And once isolation happens, interpretation becomes easier to project onto them, because the mind naturally fills missing continuity. That is how visual cognition works. It prefers complete shapes over partial information. Even when the underlying system does not support that completeness. There is also a technical aspect of early space imaging that contributes to this confusion. Early cameras used in orbital missions were not optimized for clarity in the way modern imaging systems are. Exposure times, film limitations, transmission compression, and radiation interference all affected the final output. Sometimes an object would appear elongated due to motion blur. Sometimes contrast would exaggerate edges that weren't physically sharp. Sometimes signal compression would introduce artifacts that resemble structure. None of these effects are unusual in the technical sense. They are expected under those conditions. but expectation and perception are not the same thing. In scientific analysis, these artifacts are accounted for during interpretation. In public circulation, they are often viewed directly without correction layers. And that difference creates interpretive distance. NASA's approach to these kinds of imaging challenges has always been grounded in cross-verification. If an object appears in one frame, analysts look for its presence across adjacent frames, trajectory consistency, and correlation with known orbital catalog data. When that process is complete, most ambiguous visuals resolve into known categories: debris, insulation, or optical distortion effects. The resolution often exists. It just doesn't always travel with the image when it enters public discussion. That separation is important because it means the mystery is not in the data itself. It is in what happens when the data is partially removed from its analytical environment. There is also something more subtle happening in how people engage with space imagery in general. When something is distant and unfamiliar, the brain assigns it more interpretive freedom. It is less constrained by everyday experience, so unusual shapes feel more open to meaning. This is especially true for orbital space, where direct sensory reference is impossible. No sound, no direct sight, only mediated images and signals, and mediation always introduces interpretation layers. The Black Knight narrative sits inside those layers, not because it is confirmed by them, but because it was shaped through them. Over time, as images were shared and reshared, the technical distinctions that originally defined them became less visible. Debris became object. Artifact became structure. Temporary alignment became presence. Each step simplified the complexity of orbital behavior into something more narratively stable, and once stability is introduced, even artificially, it tends to persist in memory. But when you return to the physical reality of orbital mechanics, the system is far less ambiguous than it appears in isolated interpretations. Objects move along predictable trajectories governed by gravity, velocity, and atmospheric drag at lower orbital altitudes. Light interaction depends on material composition and angle. Apparent structure often disappears when viewed across multiple observation points. In that framework, the conditions that generate mysterious appearances are not rare. They are routine, which changes the nature of the question entirely. Instead of asking what a single image might represent, the more accurate question becomes how often transient alignment can produce misleading visual structure in a high-motion reflective environment. And in that question, the answer is already well understood within orbital science. It happens frequently enough that systems are specifically designed to account for it. So as this chapter gently closes, the focus is no longer on the idea of something hidden in orbit. It is on the environment that makes brief ambiguity possible in the first place. And how that ambiguity, when isolated from its context, becomes the foundation for long-lasting narrative reinterpretation. That is where we pause. The silence in space isn't empty. It only feels empty when nothing changes fast enough for the mind to notice it. But in reality, everything is moving, slowly, constantly, and without pause. And that's where this part of the story needs to stay grounded again. Not in mystery, not in interpretation, but in the physical behavior of the environment that produced all these confusing impressions in the first place. When we talk about orbital objects, whether debris, satellites, or fragments from old missions, the key thing to understand is instability of perception, not instability of space itself, but instability of how space appears when observed through limited frames. A fragment can rotate in sunlight in a way that briefly creates the illusion of symmetry. A piece of insulation can stretch and fold in microgravity, holding a shape for just long enough to be captured once, then shifting completely in the next moment. Even camera exposure differences can freeze motion in a way that feels structured when it is actually transitional, and transitional states are dangerous for interpretation because the mind doesn't naturally think in in-between motion. It thinks in objects, stable things, defined things. So when it sees something mid-transition, it completes it automatically. That completion is where most of the confusion begins, not in the data, but in the mind trying to stabilize the data. This is also why isolated frames from space missions can feel misleading when removed from their sequence. One frame shows shape, the next shows nothing recognizable, the one after that shows motion blur. But if you only ever see the first frame, your brain locks onto the version that looked most real. That is how perception anchors itself. And once anchored, it resists correction unless the full sequence is reintroduced. In the case of the Black Knight images that circulate publicly, that full sequence is usually missing. Not because it is hidden, but because most public discussions only extract the most visually striking moment and detach it from surrounding frames. That single extracted moment then becomes the identity of the object, even though identity in orbital mechanics is never based on a single observation. It is based on trajectory consistency over time, and when you restore that missing time dimension, the illusion of structure becomes harder to maintain, because motion breaks it apart. There is also something very important about how space debris actually behaves that often gets overlooked in simplified explanations. Objects in orbit are not static points. They are constantly adjusting orientation due to gravitational gradients, atmospheric drag at lower altitudes, and residual forces from previous mission events. Even something as small as a torn thermal sheet can behave unpredictably, folding, rotating, flattening, or stretching, depending on local conditions. To an observer capturing a single moment, this behavior can look intentional, but intention is not part of the system. It is physics interacting with material properties under extreme conditions. NASA's tracking systems account for this by relying on continuous observation and predictive modeling rather than single-frame analysis. That is why debris catalogs are built on orbital paths, not visual snapshots, because orbit tells truth more reliably than appearance, and appearance is what usually misleads interpretation in narratives like Black Knight. When older imagery is revisited without that orbital context, it becomes easy to assign meaning based on visual impression alone, especially when the image quality is low or when contrast and compression distort fine details. A faint shape becomes a structure. A shadow becomes depth. A blur becomes motion with intent, but none of that survives when the object is tracked over multiple frames or aligned with known orbital behavior. That is where the interpretation collapses back into physics. There is also a psychological layer that keeps these interpretations alive in discussion spaces. Human memory tends to compress experiences into simplified images rather than continuous data. So instead of remembering a rotating piece of debris observed across multiple frames, people remember a strange object in space. And that compression is not wrong, it is just incomplete. Incomplete memory is often the source of persistent narrative ambiguity, not deception, not hidden truth, just reduction. And reduction changes everything, because once a complex system is reduced to a single symbolic idea, it becomes easier to retell than to correct. That is how the Black Knight idea survives across decades of discussion, not as a verified object, but as a compressed symbol of early space uncertainty, a symbol that represents more than its original data ever supported. When you return to the technical layer, the system becomes much less ambiguous. Orbital mechanics are consistent, tracking systems are precise, debris behavior is well modeled, and imaging artifacts are well understood under known environmental constraints. The uncertainty exists only when those layers are stripped away, which is exactly what happens in fragmented storytelling environments. So at this point in the narrative, there is no hidden structure to uncover, only the realization that most of what felt like structure was momentary alignment between motion, light, and perception, and that alignment dissolves when seen across time instead of a single instant. That is where this part settles, not in conclusion, but in clarity that removes the need for one. It's easy to forget that space doesn't hold anything in place the way we imagine it. Everything is in motion, always. Even the things that look still are only still because we are catching them at the wrong scale of time. That's where Chapter 7 settles in again, not as a shift in topic, but as a return to something more physical, something you can almost strip interpretation away from if you focus long enough. When people talk about objects in orbit, especially unusual ones, they often forget how fragile appearance becomes at orbital speed. A fragment of material doesn't stay a fragment in how it looks to an observer. It rotates, twists, catches sunlight, slips into shadow, then reappears differently seconds later. To a tracking system built on continuous data, that's normal behavior. But to a human looking at a frozen frame, it becomes something else entirely. A shape, a presence, sometimes even a structure. And once the mind labels it, it stops seeing it as motion. It starts seeing it as thing. That shift is subtle, but it's the core of almost every visual misunderstanding tied to stories like the Black Knight narrative. Because nothing in those early images was ever truly static, not debris, not insulation, not even the camera perspective itself. Everything was part of a moving system that only makes sense when viewed across time, not inside a single captured moment. This is also why engineers never rely on single-frame interpretation in orbital analysis. One image is never treated as evidence of identity. It's treated as a slice of behavior. And behavior only becomes meaningful when it's observed across sequence. That sequence is what removes illusion, but public circulation rarely carries sequences forward intact. Instead, it carries highlights, isolated moments that look unusual without the frames around them. And isolation changes everything. Because once motion is removed from context, the brain does something automatic. It reconstructs continuity. It fills the missing frames without asking. It assumes stability where there is only transition. That reconstruction is where most mystery objects are born, not in space, but in perception. Even radio signals follow a similar pattern of misunderstanding when taken out of their full system context. A delayed reflection or irregular return means very little on its own. It only gains meaning when compared against environmental conditions, atmospheric layers, transmission angles, and system calibration states at the exact moment of observation. Without that, it just looks like an anomaly. But in reality, it is often just physics behaving normally under conditions that weren't fully visible to the observer at the time. That difference between incomplete observation and unknown phenomenon is where a lot of long-lived narratives quietly form, because the human mind doesn't like partial answers sitting alone. It tries to complete them, and once completion happens emotionally, it tends to stick, even if later technical explanation changes the picture. That's why stories like Black Knight don't survive because they resist explanation. They survive because they were never fully integrated into explanation in the first place at the moment people first encountered them. By the time explanation arrives, the story already exists in a different layer of memory, one built from fragments, images without sequences, signals without full system data, descriptions without full technical context. And those fragments, once separated, become easy to reinterpret as something larger than they originally were. When you reconstruct them back into their full environment, orbital motion, debris tracking, signal modeling, imaging conditions, the structure that seemed unusual starts dissolving into expected behavior again. Not because anything is being forced away, but because the missing continuity is restored, and continuity is what was missing all along. There is no hidden object waiting behind that gap, only motion that was never fully visible in its original form. Only signals that made sense inside systems that were larger than a single recorded moment. Only images that were never meant to be interpreted in isolation. And once that's understood, the narrative stops feeling like something unresolved. It starts feeling like something that was never actually separate from known physics in the first place, just fragmented by the way it was seen. We continue from the same place, without trying to force anything into a conclusion it doesn't naturally reach. Because at this point in the story, the important shift isn't about what was out there. It's about what changes when you stop treating isolated moments as complete truths. In orbital environments, nothing is ever experienced in isolation unless it's artificially separated. That's the key idea that quietly runs through everything connected to this narrative. A fragment of debris doesn't exist as a shape. It exists as motion through a gravitational field, interacting with sunlight, Earth's shadow, and residual forces from its origin. What it looks like at any given instant is just a temporary arrangement of those conditions, and that arrangement is never stable. It's constantly breaking and reforming. So when early space imagery captures one of those moments, it's not capturing an object in the way everyday thinking assumes. It's capturing a configuration, a passing state, something that will not exist in the same form a second later. But the human mind doesn't naturally store passing states very well. It stores objects, things that feel consistent across time. So when that single captured configuration gets detached from its surrounding movement, it starts to feel like a fixed entity. That's where interpretation begins to separate from reality, not through error, but through simplification. And simplification is necessary for memory, even if it distorts technical accuracy. This is why so many early space-related anomalies survive in cultural memory, even after being explained in scientific terms. The explanation exists in one layer, but the simplified memory exists in another. They don't overwrite each other. They coexist. And whichever one gets reinforced more often becomes the dominant version in conversation. In the case of Black Knight, what gets reinforced most often isn't the technical breakdown of debris behavior or signal reflection models. It's the image fragments, the isolated mentions, the summaries of uncertainty. Not the full analytical resolution. So over time, the narrative stabilizes around incompleteness itself, not because incompleteness is evidence of something unknown, but because incompleteness is easier to repeat than full context. Full context requires structure, sequence, and explanation. Fragments require none of that. They only require recognition. There's also something deeper happening in how people relate to space in general. Space is one of the few environments humans engage with entirely through indirect perception. There is no direct sensory experience of orbit, no sound, no physical presence, only data, images, signals, and models. That separation creates a natural openness to interpretation, because when experience is mediated, certainty always feels slightly out of reach, and anything that feels slightly out of reach tends to invite speculation, even when the underlying system is well understood. This doesn't mean the system is mysterious. It means the access to it is indirect, and indirect access always introduces interpretive space. NASA's work and the work of orbital tracking systems in general is built specifically to reduce that interpretive space through cross-verification, multiple sensors, multiple frames, continuous tracking, predictive modeling. Everything designed to turn isolated moments into continuous understanding. But when that continuous understanding is not carried into public reinterpretation, only the isolated moments remain visible. And isolated moments are always more emotionally suggestive than continuous systems. That's the gap the Black Knight narrative lives inside. Not a gap in physics, a gap in visibility of continuity. Once you see enough orbital data in sequence, the illusion of a fixed object from a single frame disappears completely. What remains is motion, fragmentation, and interaction with light and environment. No structure persists across time unless it is intentionally engineered to do so. And debris is not engineered for persistence. It is engineered for decay. Slowly, inevitably, it loses stability and integrates back into the broader orbital environment through gravitational and atmospheric processes. So even the most structured-looking fragments are temporary by nature. That temporariness is what single-frame interpretation hides, and that hiding is what creates the sense of something unresolved. But once time is reintroduced into the observation, once you stop looking at moments and start looking at sequences, the unresolved feeling doesn't remain. It dissolves into predictable behavior, not because anything is being dismissed, but because nothing separate ever fully formed in the first place. And that is where this part naturally settles again, not at an answer. but at the point where the question itself stops holding together when viewed across time instead of isolation. We're staying in the same current now, without forcing it into something it's not. Because once you understand how much of this comes down to what is missing between frames, the entire feeling of mystery starts to shift shape on its own, not disappear, just lose its sharp edges. In orbital observation, continuity is everything. Not because it makes things more interesting, but because it's the only way motion can actually be understood correctly. A single frame is never meant to stand alone. It's like freezing a wave in the ocean and trying to decide what the ocean is doing from that one frozen shape. It might look like a structure for a moment, but the moment is the problem, not the ocean. That same issue sits quietly underneath most interpretations tied to the Black Knight narrative. The images, the claims, the scattered references, they all depend heavily on moments extracted from systems that were originally designed to be read as sequences. When that sequence is removed, something very natural happens. The brain fills the gap, not with invention, but with assumption. It assumes continuity. It assumes stability. It assumes objectness where there is only motion. And once that assumption settles in, it becomes surprisingly resistant to correction, not because the correction is unclear, but because it doesn't match the shape the mind has already built. That shape feels complete, even if it was built from fragments. In real orbital tracking systems, this never happens in isolation. Every detected object is continuously reevaluated across multiple passes. Its position is not a single point, it's a path, a prediction updated again and again as new data arrives. So identity in space is never based on appearance alone. It is based on behavior over time. That distinction is what completely separates scientific classification from visual interpretation, and most confusion begins when that distinction is quietly removed. A piece of debris might reflect sunlight in a way that looks structured for a few seconds. But across its full orbital pass, it will rotate, shift, lose that alignment, regain it briefly, and then disappear into shadow again. The structure only exists in the brief alignment window, not in the object itself. This is why engineers don't describe orbiting material in terms of shape from a single image. They describe it in terms of trajectory, spin rate, material properties, and expected light interaction. Because shape is unstable, motion is not. In older satellite imagery, especially early missions, the problem becomes even more noticeable. Lower resolution, limited frame rates, and analog-to-digital transitions all introduce artifacts that can look meaningful if seen alone, but those artifacts behave inconsistently across frames. And inconsistency is the first sign that what you're seeing is not a fixed object. It is a recording effect interacting with movement. Still, when only one of those frames enters public circulation, the rest of the corrective structure is missing. And missing structure always creates interpretive freedom. That freedom is what allows narratives like Black Knight to persist in cultural memory, not as confirmed entities, but as unresolved impressions of early space observation. Impressions that were never fully reassembled into their original analytical context. There is also something worth noticing about how unknown behaves in these discussions. Unknown doesn't always mean not understood. Often it simply means not fully reconstructed in its original system context. But in public language, those two meanings collapse into one. And once they collapse, every incomplete observation starts to feel like a candidate for deeper significance, even when the underlying system already has a well-defined explanation. NASA's approach to this is almost always retrospective and structural. Instead of engaging with isolated interpretations, it reconstructs the full observational environment: timing, trajectory, instrument state, environmental conditions, and cross-reference data from other systems. When that reconstruction is complete, the majority of unknowns resolve into expected behavior, not because they were misinterpreted maliciously, but because they were incomplete when first seen. And incompleteness is not a property of the object. It is a property of the observation. That distinction quietly dissolves much of the narrative tension that surrounds long-running space mysteries, but it doesn't erase curiosity. It just relocates it. From what is that object to how did the observation environment create the impression of something unknown in the first place? And that is a very different question, a more grounded one, a more technical one, but also a more honest one in terms of how perception actually works in indirect observation systems. Because in the end, nothing about orbital space requires hidden structures or unexplained objects for complexity to exist. Complexity already exists in motion, light interaction, and incomplete sampling of fast-moving environments. And when that complexity is reduced into isolated visuals or fragments of data, it naturally produces interpretive gaps. Those gaps are where stories form, not because something is being concealed, but because something was never fully carried forward in its original form. And once that understanding settles in, the Black Knight narrative stops feeling like a puzzle waiting for a missing piece. It starts feeling like a collection of moments that were never designed to be interpreted alone. It's interesting how, the deeper you go into these kinds of discussions, the less it feels like you're uncovering something hidden, and more like you're slowly watching how human perception builds scaffolding over incomplete information. That's where Chapter 8 continues now. Because at this point in the narrative, the focus is no longer on the objects, the signals, or the images themselves. It's on the mind that keeps revisiting them. When people encounter something they don't fully understand, especially something distant like space, the brain doesn't like leaving it open. It doesn't like unresolved edges, so it does something very subtle. It starts smoothing the gaps. It connects separate points. It reduces randomness. It creates a sense of continuity even when none was originally recorded, and that continuity feels real, even comforting in a strange way. That's part of why narratives like the Black Knight idea don't just vanish after explanation. They don't survive because they resist understanding. They survive because the mind keeps reassembling them in quieter moments, trying to make them feel complete, not necessarily as belief, but as structure. Something the mind can hold without friction. In psychology, this is closely tied to pattern completion. When information is incomplete, especially visual or narrative information, the brain automatically tries to resolve it into a stable form. It prefers something over unclear nothing. So a blurred object becomes a shape. A delayed signal becomes a pattern. Disconnected reports become a sequence. And once that sequence exists internally, even loosely, it starts to feel like memory rather than interpretation. That distinction is important, because memory feels certain, even when it's built from uncertain inputs. This is where the Black Knight narrative quietly shifts away from being a space mystery and becomes more of a case study in how humans process ambiguity, not in a dramatic sense, but in a very ordinary, almost invisible way. You see a fragment of information once. Later, you hear it again in a slightly different form, then again in another context. Over time, those versions merge in your mind into a single, simplified idea, not because you chose to distort it, but because repetition naturally compresses variation, and compression removes detail. What remains is the most emotionally stable version of the idea. This is also why explanations often feel less memorable than mysteries. Explanation spreads information out. It adds layers, conditions, and constraints. It reduces emotional sharpness in exchange for accuracy. But the mind tends to retain sharpness more easily than structure. So even when a technical explanation exists for something like orbital debris behavior, signal reflection, or imaging artifacts, it doesn't always overwrite the earlier simplified impression. Both versions can coexist, one in analytical understanding, one in narrative memory. And they don't necessarily conflict in a conscious way. They just operate in different layers of thought. NASA's work, when seen through this lens, is not about removing mystery, but about constantly refining the technical layer so that interpretation can be grounded whenever it is revisited. But that grounding doesn't automatically transfer into public narrative unless the full context is also carried forward, and it often is, because full context is heavy. It doesn't travel easily in fragments, posts, or visual snippets. So what travels instead is the simplified form. And simplified forms are what stories are built from. At this stage, the Black Knight narrative doesn't really function as a claim about a physical object anymore. It functions more like a shared reference point for incomplete early space imagery and communication anomalies, regardless of their actual classification. A kind of mental shortcut for things from early space history that felt unclear at first glance. And once something becomes a shortcut like that, it stops needing precision to survive. It only needs recognition. That's enough for it to keep reappearing in discussion spaces, documentaries, and reinterpretations. Not because new evidence is constantly reinforcing it, but because old fragments are still circulating without full contextual restoration. And as long as that continues, the narrative continues to feel active, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a pattern that keeps getting reassembled from incomplete pieces of memory and interpretation. And that is where this part naturally settles, not into resolution, but into understanding how easily unresolved feeling can persist even when the underlying system has already been explained. It begins with the leftovers of everything that has already been seen, discussed, and slowly reshaped in memory, because by this point, nothing about the Black Knight narrative exists in a single form anymore. It exists in versions. Slight variations of the same idea carried through different interpretations, different retellings, different levels of technical understanding. And that alone changes how the story behaves. When something is repeated often enough in slightly altered forms, it stops feeling like a single claim and starts feeling like a pattern of thought. Not this object exists, but this idea keeps returning. That distinction is where Chapter 9 quietly settles in, At its core, what remains now is not a satellite, not a signal, and not even a specific image. What remains is a mental structure built from fragments of early space observation, later reinterpretation, and repeated cultural referencing. And structures like that are surprisingly stable, even when their original foundation is weak or incomplete, because they are not held together by evidence. They are held together by familiarity. Every time the idea is revisited, even casually, it reinforces itself slightly, not in content but in recognition. The brain remembers that it has seen this pattern before, and that recognition gives it continuity. That's how something can feel known without ever being fully verified. In earlier parts of this discussion, the focus was on signals, images, orbital debris, and the technical realities of how space observation works. But here, all of that begins to fade into the background, not because it is irrelevant, but because it has already done its job. It has shown how easily isolated observations can be misread when removed from full context. Now the attention shifts away from the data itself and toward the way those data fragments survive after explanation. Because even after technical clarification exists, fragments don't disappear from circulation. They continue to be reused in simplified form, especially in spaces where brevity matters more than completeness, and every reuse slightly detaches them further from their original explanation. Over time, what was once a technical anomaly becomes a reference point, a shorthand. A familiar example used to represent something in space that was once unclear. That transformation is subtle but powerful, because once something becomes shorthand, it no longer needs to be fully accurate to remain useful in conversation. It only needs to be recognizable. And recognition is a strong form of persistence. This is why narratives like Black Knight tend to outlast their original technical relevance, not because they resist explanation, but because explanation and cultural memory don't operate at the same speed. Technical systems update continuously. Memory updates slowly and unevenly. So there is always a delay between what is known and what is remembered. And in that delay, older interpretations can continue to circulate without being fully replaced. NASA's role in this structure remains grounded in continuous refinement of orbital data, classification systems, and long-term tracking of known objects. From that perspective, the environment that produced early ambiguity has become far more controlled and predictable over time. But cultural narratives don't always update alongside that refinement. They preserve earlier states of uncertainty. Not because they reject newer understanding, but because earlier versions of a story often feel more emotionally complete than corrected ones. That emotional completeness is what keeps them active in memory. So at this point, the Black Knight idea is no longer functioning as a question about a specific object in orbit. It is functioning as an example of how incomplete early observations can evolve into long-lived interpretive frameworks when they are repeatedly revisited outside their original context. And that framework, once formed, becomes self-sustaining through repetition alone, not through evidence, not through confirmation, but through familiarity reinforced over time. And that is where Chapter 9 pauses. Not at an answer, but at the realization that some narratives persist not because they remain unsolved, but because they were built from fragments that were never fully intended to stand as a single unified picture in the first place. The strange thing about ideas like this is that they don't fade in a straight line. They don't just weaken with time or disappear once explanation arrives. Instead, they settle into the background and slowly change shape depending on where they're being remembered. In technical spaces, the idea collapses into classification: debris, signal reflection, imaging artifact, misinterpretation of limited data. In casual discussion spaces, it becomes something else entirely, a reference point for things that were once unclear in space, a kind of shared shorthand that doesn't need full explanation anymore. And that split is where the narrative quietly stabilizes, because once an idea exists in two different forms like that, it no longer depends on a single truth to survive. It survives through repetition across contexts that don't fully align with each other. That's why it keeps resurfacing, even after long gaps of silence, not because new evidence is constantly bringing it back, but because old fragments are still circulating in simplified form, and those fragments are enough. In many ways, the Black Knight narrative isn't sustained by the original reports at all anymore. It is sustained by how often those reports are indirectly referenced, summarized, or visually recycled without their original analytical structure. Each time that happens, a small amount of context is lost, not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough that the connection back to the full system becomes slightly weaker. And when enough of those small losses accumulate, what remains is a version of the idea that feels complete on its own, even though it is no longer attached to the environment that originally defined it. That's the quiet mechanism behind most long-lived space mysteries, not secrecy, not hidden layers, but gradual separation between data and context over time. There is also something very human underneath all of this. The mind doesn't treat uncertainty as a temporary condition. It tends to store it as a category, something that can be returned to later without needing full reconstruction of the original system. So when an idea is labeled, even loosely, as unexplained, that label can outlast the explanation that eventually follows, because the label is simpler to recall than the resolution. And simplicity always travels further in memory. This is why explanations often feel less present in public discourse than the mysteries they address. Not because the explanations are weaker, but because they require more structure to fully understand, while the mystery only requires recognition, and recognition is effortless. So even in a world where orbital tracking is precise, satellite catalogs are extensive, and imaging systems are highly advanced, older fragments of uncertainty can still circulate independently in simplified form, not as competing truth, but as residual memory. And residual memory is what keeps narratives like this from fully disappearing. At this point, there is no new discovery waiting underneath the idea, no hidden object waiting to be revealed by reinterpretation. What remains is the way the idea itself evolved through fragmentation, repetition, and selective memory over time. That evolution is the real subject now, not what was seen, but how what was seen continued to exist after it stopped being a direct observation, and that is where this section gently settles. There's a kind of stillness that comes after everything has already been said in different ways. Not silence, just a slowing down of how the idea moves through thought. At this point, the Black Knight narrative doesn't feel like something unfolding anymore. It feels like something that has already finished forming and is now just being looked at from slightly different distances. And when you step back far enough, the structure becomes simpler than it first appeared, not because anything was removed, but because repetition eventually reveals what was always consistent underneath. It was never a single object holding the story together. It was the act of partial observation being repeated across time, across systems, and across memory. That's the core of it. Everything else, signals, images, interpretations, discussions, sits on top of that layer. And once you see that layer clearly, the rest stops behaving like separate mysteries. It starts behaving like variations of the same process. Something is observed incompletely. That incompleteness is recorded. The record is shared without full context. And over time, the missing context is replaced with interpretation, not intentionally, just naturally, through how information spreads when it is separated from its original environment. In space science, this is something that gets corrected continuously through updated tracking systems, revised catalogs, and multi-source verification. Each object is redefined not by how it looks in a single moment, but by how it behaves across time. That continuous correction is what prevents ambiguity from becoming permanent inside technical systems. But outside those systems, once information enters fragmented circulation, it doesn't always get reassembled in the same structured way. Instead, it gets compressed, and compression changes meaning without changing the words themselves. A detailed explanation becomes a simple label, a sequence becomes a snapshot, a system becomes an object, and once that happens, the original framework that held everything together is no longer visible in the same way. That is where long-lived narratives find space to persist, not in contradiction to explanation, but in separation from it. They continue to exist in parallel layers of understanding, one precise, one simplified, one complete, one remembered, and both operating at the same time without fully merging back into each other. The Black Knight idea sits in that separation, not as an unresolved phenomenon in the scientific sense, but as an example of how fragmented early observation, limited public context, and repeated reinterpretation can create a stable narrative structure over time. Even after the original conditions that produce the uncertainty are fully understood, because understanding doesn't always replace memory. It often just exists alongside it, and memory tends to favor what is easiest to recall, not what is most complete. So what remains at the end of all this is not a mystery waiting for closure. It is a pattern that explains why certain ideas survive long after their technical foundations have been clarified, not because they resist resolution, but because they were never carried forward in full form in the first place. And once something exists only in fragments, it will always be open to being reassembled again and again in new ways. That is where this journey settles, not in an answer, but in the quiet recognition of how easily fragments become stories, and how stories keep living even after the systems that created them have already moved on. What remains now is less about what happened and more about what happens when enough distance builds up between an event and the way it is remembered, because distance changes everything. Not in a dramatic way, not like something breaking or disappearing, but in the quiet way details soften at the edges when they are no longer being actively checked against their original source. In the case of Black Knight, that distance is what allowed it to become what it is in public memory today. Not a fixed claim, not a verified object, but a layered idea built from older fragments of space observation, early communication limitations, and later reinterpretations that didn't always carry the full technical background with them. And once that background is no longer present, the fragments begin to behave differently. They start connecting to each other in ways they were never originally connected. A signal anomaly from one context gets mentally linked to an image from another. A tracking uncertainty becomes associated with unrelated orbital debris discussions. A mention of unidentified object in early summaries gets pulled into a larger, more unified mental picture, not because the data says they belong together, but because the mind prefers coherence over separation. Coherence feels complete, even when it is assembled from unrelated parts. That is how a narrative can grow without new evidence being added to it. The structure strengthens not through discovery, but through repetition of association. Each time the idea is revisited, it doesn't need to introduce anything new. It only needs to reconnect familiar fragments in slightly familiar ways. And that repetition is enough to maintain its presence in memory spaces where precision is not being actively enforced. Meanwhile, in the technical world, nothing about orbital observation depends on interpretation in that way. Objects are tracked continuously. Their positions are calculated across time, not inferred from isolated appearances. Their classification depends on behavior, trajectory, and consistency across multiple data sources. In that system, ambiguity is temporary by design. It exists only until more data resolves it. But when those resolved systems are later viewed through fragmented summaries, the resolution itself can become invisible. What remains visible is only the earlier state of uncertainty, and that earlier state is what gets remembered. This is why older space-related anomalies often feel more persistent in cultural memory than in technical literature. Not because they remain unresolved, but because the resolution process is not always part of the version that circulates publicly. So what people remember is not the full arc of observation, but the midpoint, where things were still unclear. And midpoints are emotionally sticky. They feel like unfinished sentences. And unfinished sentences invite continuation. That is where most long-running narratives sustain themselves, including this one, not in contradiction to science, but in separation from its full explanatory path. The Black Knight idea, when viewed through that lens, stops being a question about a specific object in orbit. It becomes an example of how partial visibility, when repeated and reinterpreted outside its original system, can form a stable narrative that feels independent of its source material, not because it escaped explanation, but because explanation and memory no longer occupy the same space in how it is carried forward. And once that separation exists, the narrative doesn't need reinforcement from new observations to persist. It only needs familiarity, and familiarity is self-sustaining. That is where everything finally settles, not into mystery, not into confirmation, but into the understanding that what endures is not always what is most accurate. Sometimes it is simply what has been repeated often enough to feel complete on its own. And that is the quiet end of this line of thought.